Okay, class. Our last lesson that we need to finish up here is lesson 18 from Unit 3. How has the Due Process Clause of the 14th Amendment changed the Constitution? So we already talked about procedural due process. Now let's explain what substantive due process is. That means the Constitution usually prohibits some kind of laws altogether. No matter how popular these laws may be, some basic human fundamental rights need to be promised to the people, even if a legislature or executive or even the people agree with some of those laws. So, says some rights are so basic to humans that we cannot make laws regulating them unless it is dire circumstances. So, like for example, some economic rights that a lot of people were really against when they first came out before 1937 was a minimum wage law, saying that there should be no minimum wage law. That prohibits some fundamental human right to be able to pay people whatever you want. Now we see it the opposite way of saying, well, people deserve a minimum wage because they're human beings. They need at least some sort of income promised to them. What are some fundamental human rights that the government should not intrude on? That's really up to your opinion. We can look at some fundamental rights that, under substantive due process, our legislative and, executive branch may have passed laws regulating these things, but our judicial branch has eventually, used this process to go against them. So, for example, a fundamental right to marry and have children was decided in the case Loving v. Virginia in 1967. In the case Griswold v. Connecticut in 1965, the ability to purchase and use birth control was considered a fundamental right. The custody of children and your ability to rear them as you see fit was a case in 1982 called Santosky v. the United States. Mentally competent adults to refuse medical treatment in Cruzen v. Director of 1990. So if you're mentally competent, you can refuse medical treatment if you wish to. In Gitlow v. New York in 1925, freedom of speech was considered a fundamental right. Shapiro v. Thompson, 1969, interstate travel is a fundamental right. Legal voters having the ability to vote in 1972 versus Dunn v. Bloomstein. To associate and to assemble in DeJonge v. Oregon in 1937, and religious freedom in Cantwell v. Connecticut in 1940. So those are a handful of fundamental human rights that have been decided within the Supreme Court. What is the doctrine of incorporation? So this is the last slide here that we're going to talk about today. Until 1925, the United States did not apply the 14th Amendment or any of the Bill of Rights to the states. They believed that it was the states' jobs to enforce due process within their own state. Now, what changed this idea that we should incorporate all the Bill of Rights, or at least most of the Bill of Rights, to the states and force them to follow the Bill of Rights? Well, it was the case Gitlow v. New York. In Gitlow, they ruled that freedom of speech and freedom of the press are fundamental due process, and states could not infringe on them. However, Gitlow was still found guilty because he published a left-wing manifesto that argued to overthrow the government, which was still not allowed according to the Supreme Court. However, he did have that First Amendment right to write whatever he wants, as long as it wasn't talking about overthrowing the government, apparently. But never mind the results of the Gitlow case. Just understand that this is one of the first cases where we incorporate your First Amendment right, and it should be applied to everybody. The idea of incorporation means using the Due Process Clause within the 14th Amendment to decide whether various guarantees in the Bill of Rights limit the states as well as the national government. Now, this is a very confusing concept to us because we just know, well, the Bill of Rights, those are your rights. Before 1925, that's not the way people thought. They thought the Bill of Rights are federal laws saying what they have to protect. States, on the other hand, can do what they choose. So, this is basically the federal government expanding their power a little bit, kind of like we've talked about with the anti-federalists worry about an expansive federal government, this is an expansive federal government. It's this process of incorporation. We've had to do it on a case-by-case basis, or we sometimes call it selective incorporation, to apply the Bill of Rights to states. Most rights have been incorporated, but the following have not yet been incorporated. So your Second Amendment right to bear arms, your Fifth Amendment right to indictment by a grand jury, Seventh Amendment jury trial in civil lawsuits, the implicit requirement in the Sixth Amendment that the jury in a criminal case must have 12 members and reach a unanimous verdict. So those are just a few of those. Should there be uniform national policy regarding rights, or should states make their own decisions? This is a question I really was looking forward to talking to you guys about in class, just because I'm curious what you think. Within the state of Indiana, we have different principles about what President Obama and our national legislature want our country to look like. Because, we're from more of a rural area here in South Whitley, Pierceton, Larwell, wherever you're from. So why should the federal government, who has no idea about our needs here in Indiana, dictate policies to us and tell us what our rights should be and shouldn't be here in Northeast Indiana? Shouldn't that be our state and local government's job to dictate what those policies should be? And even as far as moral conduct is concerned, don't we as citizens in our own community get to dictate what kind of moral character we want from our society? So therefore, shouldn't we be able to make our own laws regarding marriage, birth control, profiling for police officers, whatever we want? Shouldn't we be able to make our own policies and not have the federal government come in and tell us what we can and can't do? So it looks like that's it for this section. Hopefully you guys are ready for the test.